Howdy doody and welcome back to America's Dark Places, a series where we shift from broad strokes of eerie state folklore to a sharper focus on the unsettling urban legends tied to one place. Today we're headed into the mountains of Shenandoah National Park. From the deeply rooted stories of the Indigenous peoples to the sorrow and bloodshed brought by the European settlers, Shenandoah breathes dark lore, some of which is still alive today, lingering in the more than 100 cemeteries scattered throughout the park and whispering through the countless historic homes and ruins tucked among the trees. Now, before we dive in though, just a quick reminder, I'm aiming to hit 100,000 subs in 2025, and hopefully I'd like to do that pretty soon. And you can help me out by liking the video, subscribing, and dropping your favorite urban legend in the comments. It's totally free and it tells the YouTube gods, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Now with that, follow me and let's explore this dark place. Tucked along the trail in Shenandoah National Park, not far from Old Rag Fire Road and the Skyline Drive corridor, sits Rock Spring Hut. It's at about 3,200 feet of elevation, surrounded by dense forests. From the outside, it looks like any other backcountry shelter. Nothing out of the ordinary. Shenandoah has 7 of these shelters, and this one isn't particularly spooky, at least not during the day. But according to an archived hiker forum post from 2006, nightfall might change your mind. The story takes place in early June of 2005. A man in his late 50s was hiking through the Appalachian Trail to celebrate his retirement. His adult daughter joined him for a few days through the well-maintained Shenandoah section. Everything was going pretty smoothly, until the weather turned. Despite clear forecasts, a torrential downpour began around 1 p.m., forcing them to call it early and seek shelter. They came across Rock Spring Hut and gladly ducked inside. They lit a small fire to cook lunch, hoping the storm might pass. Unfortunately, it didn't though, and by 4:30 p.m., they figured they'd spend the night here. They were alone at least, which was a nice change in their minds because the previous shelter had been pretty crowded. Despite the unplanned setback this day, they called the day a success and settled in after sunset. It was around 8:30 p.m. The rain had finally stopped, and after a restful day, they quickly fell asleep. But they didn't for long. Around 11 p.m., they were jolted awake by the sound of a large branch snapping nearby. Now, we should be clear, this isn't too strange. This is bear and deer country after all, and there's plenty of both. But then came something else, a low guttural clicking sound. Not the kind a deer makes, not a bear either. The man compared it to something from the Predator movies. Then they spotted it. It was, well, they weren't sure what it was, but it was something tall, well over 6 feet, but it wasn't covered in fur, it wasn't like Bigfoot. It had pale, hairless skin, and long, sharp fingers it used to brace itself on nearby trees. And it was also pretty lanky. Honestly, to me, it sounds like they were essentially describing the rake, that internet cryptid. But the thing is, the rake had only just been invented on 4chan a few months earlier, I'm not even kidding. This was long before the legend had spread to the extent it is today. Whatever it was, it eventually moved on. It apparently was drawn away by another branch snapping deeper in the woods. Hopefully a raccoon was its dinner instead of these people. The two sat frozen for about half an hour after this before the father finally whispered, "Was that tea we had before bed drugged?" His daughter pretty much agreed with the sentiment that this didn't feel real. For a while after this, they of course stayed up. They were talking in hushed tones, debating whether to pack up and hike out, since sleep clearly wasn't an option at this point. And then something happened, perhaps lured by their voices. Without a sound from the surrounding woods or over their head, they both noticed it at once. A long head and 2 black eyes slowly lowered down from the roofline of the shelter and stared straight at the father through the entrance. It didn't blink, it didn't really even move, it just lowered down and stared at them. And they said that this was for about 15 minutes that it sat completely still, staring at the father, perhaps waiting for movement. It didn't make a single movement. It didn't make a single sound. It just maintained eye contact with the father. And then, just as silently, it pulled back up and it disappeared. This time, they didn't say a word until the sun came up. At first light, though, they grabbed their gear and they hiked out fast. The father continued this through hike, but they both spent the next night in a motel in Lurie to recover and regroup. As far as anyone knows, neither of them ever spoke about the creature again, even though this account remained active on the hiker forum. Now, normally I'd chalk something like this up to internet storytelling. If this was the only account, I'd probably call it a creepypasta tale and move on. But here's where it gets interesting. There are other one-off stories from around Shenandoah that describe something similar, something people nowadays call pale crawlers. These things are reported to be, of course, pale, but also hairless, lanky, and with black eyes. So pretty much the same creature these two saw. One such story supposedly comes from a Shenandoah National Park ranger in the spring of 2022. Apparently visitors around the Old Rag and Bird's Nest Shelter No. 1 area that's further down the east side of the mountain range reported hearing these weird clicking noises again at night, and when a ranger went to investigate, he reportedly saw something that matched the description of what these two saw in 2005. To be clear, I don't know if I believe in pale crawlers, which is a mild way of saying I think they're malarkey. Most stories about them popped up years after the rake became popular online. But this one predates all of that, or at least occurred parallel to the creation of the rake. It was posted on an active hiker forum by someone with regular presence on that forum too, someone that otherwise posted about serious topics. That's what makes this kind of eerie. Now maybe it's a creepypasta before creepypasta were a thing, before people were used to lying on the internet, although that's probably always been the case, or maybe, just maybe, this is the needle in the proverbial haystack, that one true story out of a million fake ones. Anyways, I thought the story was interesting, and I especially think it's interesting since it pretty much predates all of the pale crawler lore. Anyways, I'm curious what you think. Are pale crawlers real? I don't think they are personally, but I want to hear what you think. Are they roaming the Blue Ridge? Let me know what you believe in the comments below. Deep in the forests of Shenandoah National Park, tucked along the Nicholson Hollow Trail, also known as Corbin Cabin Trail, stands a modest chestnut log structure, worn by time but still standing. Hikers passing through often marvel at the quiet, the distance from the modern world, and the eerie silence that lingers in the trees. Some keep walking, others stay the night, and some say they leave with stories they can't quite explain. But before the ghost tales begin, this cabin belonged to a man named George Thurman Corbin, and the story of his life is etched into every timber and stone in this hidden hollow. George Corbin was born in 1888, right here in the rugged backcountry of what would later become Shenandoah National Park. The land was rough and wild, and the people who lived here, homesteaders, farmers, and tradesmen, were resilient. George was no different. By his own admission, he worked all kinds of jobs in his time. For 5 years, for instance, he dabbled in moonshining, distilling a peach brandy he proudly called a good one in a later interview, even in his old age, which in moonshiner terms might mean I didn't go blind from it. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, and by the time he was 21 or 22, around 1909, he set his sights on building a home. George selected an isolated plot of land in Nicholson Hollow, surrounded by ridges and forests that could pass as untouched today. With the help of 10 friends and neighbors, most of whose homes no longer stand, George cut, hauled, and shaped the logs by hand, which is incredible to me considering I nearly died trying to hang a floating shelf a few weeks ago. Remarkably, the bulk of the work was done in a single day. He even crafted the wooden beams and roof shingles by himself. The iron fence that surrounds the cabin was bought, sure, but George hauled it up the mountain himself, so I'm giving him full credit regardless. By the time he moved into this cabin, George had already lost his first wife, Mildred Corbin, who passed away while he was still living with his father elsewhere in the region. She didn't die in the cabin, but that early loss seemed to set the tone for the years that followed. In 1911, George married Bertie T. Nicholson, his second wife. She would be the mother of 4 of his children, and together they tried to make a life in this remote place. The nearest road was miles away. In fact, only one car ever actually reached this cabin while George lived there, his sister's Model T. He actually kept his own car parked 2 miles down the mountain because he didn't dare drive up the treacherous trails, proving George was brave, but not stupid, in stark contrast to many who use Google Maps in the national parks nowadays. Now, despite the fact that this place is secluded, which is paradise to some, tragedy visited the Corbin cabin once again. In 1924, Bertie, again George's second wife, died during childbirth, right inside this very home George had built with his own hands. The baby did survive, but only just, and sadly it only knew its mother for about 3 hours. The child was then passed among family for a time before returning to George, who by then had married again. His third wife, Beulah Nicholson, would raise the boy. Birdie's grave lies nearby, part of a small but sort of lost-in-the-woods family cemetery that George confirmed contained 25 individuals. In a rare and haunting oral history interview now archived by James Madison University, George himself recalls her death, with a soft southern drawl and a quiet weight in his voice. By 1938, George and his children, along with many others, were forced to leave when the land was absorbed into Shenandoah National Park. Their homes were seized, their lives uprooted, but the cabin survived. In 1954, it was given to the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, who maintain it to this day, and it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And yes, you can still rent it. For about $50 to $80 a night, you too can sleep where a moonshiner once made love, lost love, and possibly saw a ghost taking a leak by the woodpile. But be warned, this cabin is said to be wicked haunted. Hikers, campers, and overnight guests often come back with stories. Some say they hear creaking floors in the cabin when no one's inside, or when they're dead asleep in their bunk beds. These footsteps, they also don't just limit themselves to inside of the cabin. They're often heard just beyond the cabin's walls. For instance, the sound of crunching leaves is frequently heard outside, leaves that are being crunched by none other than human footsteps. Also, there's a vocal presence at times. Whispers, voices, often coming from the tree line as you stand just outside of the cabin. Usually, those who have heard this phenomenon claim it's the voice of a woman. Of course, they say this woman is Birdie Nicholson, George's second wife, who is still roaming the woods where she died. Separated too soon from the child she only held for a few fleeting hours, a mother's grief echoing across generations, and in the silence of the hollow, when the wind dies down, some swear they hear her calling, of course, searching for eternity for her child she never really got to hold. So whether you're a lover of history, or someone brave enough to spend the night in one of the most remote corners of the park, Corbin Cabin is an awesome stop. I've actually been to this cabin, and I've stood inside of it for a moment, but sadly I did not stay the night there. Now, actually spending the night there is most certainly on my bucket list. Regardless, this place stands as a tribute to Appalachian grit, to the people that once carved a life from the mountains, but also, as many believe, it's a place where the past has never truly gone quiet, a memorial of sorts. And if you're curious, that interview with George, you can find it online. About a third of it, I'll admit, is him reminiscing about moonshining days, sure, but somewhere in the recording, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the echoes of a life that never really left the hollow. Who knows, maybe George himself now haunts these walls too. If you want to listen, I've left the link in the description of the video. If you caught my Virginia video, then you already know we talked about the Wood Booger of Northern Virginia, their very own breed of Bigfoot. That's down south, but wouldn't you know it, just a bit to the north, they've got their own breed of wood boogers too. And these Shenandoah big-footed boogers, they've got history, like real history, not just some guy on Reddit yelling about his blurry trail cam footage. First, let's roll it all the way back. Before Europeans came stomping through with their muskets, the Monacan and Manahoac tribes told stories of a creature they called the Forest Shadows. Now, they have a proper Native American name for this, but I couldn't find any examples of how to say it online, so I'll just put it on the screen here. I didn't want to butcher it. Now, I'll admit, Forest Shadows does sound like a brand of cologne you'd find in the camping aisle, but these weren't monsters to the native people. These creatures were revered by them. They were said to be the spirits of their ancestors, chosen by the Great Spirit to protect the land that is now Shenandoah National Park. These forest shadows were described by the natives as tall, shadowy figures with long hair and eyes that sparkled like the stars, sort of like Tony Chopper after a handful of rumble balls. These shiny eyes were said to be proof of their age-old wisdom, of the lands they inhabited. Most, by the way, don't liken their description of being shadowy as them being akin to shadow people. Rather, they liken it to the ability of Bigfoot-like creatures to remain quiet, elusive, and only be seen from the distance. The kind of figure you only catch out of the corner of your eye in the woods, but never really get a great view of. They were always keenly aware of the world around them, and no pesky humans would easily get a good look at them. Now, of course, when Europeans arrived and heard native accounts, their first reaction was pretty much disbelief. They didn't buy the native stories of the forest shadows, but as we all know, that wouldn't last for long. After a while, these settlers began to see things, big, hairy things, things that hummed in the night. I'm not kidding either. Multiple reports I read say these wood boogers made a soft, melodic humming sound at night to communicate with each other. Imagine lying in your 18th century canvas tent, terrified of bears and dysentery, and suddenly you hear some baritone music drifting through the trees. One report I saw painted this as oddly comforting, though they did simultaneously note that despite this soothing noise, in the back of their mind, they noted they were likely hearing something akin to Bigfoot cry out to its kin, which was an extremely scary circumstance. Again, it's worth noting the term wood booger is derivative of boogeyman. Yes, that's the origin of their namesake as boogers. Boogers, bogies, I hope you can see how that evolved. Anyway, I do think it's pretty appropriate that a creature that would be viewed as a guardian by the natives would be a boogeyman to the Europeans. These Europeans were encroachers, after all. They were invading the native lands. It's no wonder that they kept their eyes peeled for something that would be more than eager to step on their toes, or maybe their heads. Admittedly, accounts by colonists of supposed sightings of wood boogers aren't all sightings from afar and humming, though. In proper Zoan-type fashion, these wood boogers were characterized as possessing great strength, and while they generally preferred to stay out of the business of natives and European visitors alike, there are accounts or two of disrespectful guests from across the Atlantic being scared into submission by logs and fallen trees being rolled downhill in their direction, or by their camps being raided, especially at night, although that was probably likely just raccoons. One account that I admittedly could find no credence for claimed that one fur trader in the region actually once awoke to one of these creatures literally kneeling over him, and that when the man woke up, the creature showed no fear, only continued curiosity. As for the man, my impression is that he forced himself to pretend to go back to sleep, and luckily everything turned out okay for him. Unsurprisingly though, and sadly, supposedly as the settlers pushed harder into the land, sightings of these wood boogers or forest shadows became rarer. By the 1800s, the accounts all but vanished, which, to be fair, wasn't hard. There were basically 2 written accounts to begin with, and they read more like someone wrote poetry about a gorilla during a bender than like they were actually taking notes to submit to National Geographic about these creatures. But now, Shenandoah is a national park, a protected place. Maybe that's why, according to some, the wood boogers are making a comeback. According to extremely credible sources like YouTubers with usernames like SquatchDaddy420, people are seeing these creatures again, not just in the south of Virginia, but right here in the calm forests of Shenandoah. If you dive into forums and comment sections, you'll find plenty of people who swear they've seen the silhouette of a tall, hairy man watching them in the woods, to which I say, sir, we talked about this in the last episode. That was probably just Bruce, but hey, maybe it was a wood booger after all. Also, Lurie, a lovely little town west of Shenandoah that's home to one of the prettiest cave systems I've been in the US, now hosts a wood booger festival. While this festival may involve more funnel cake and face painting than actual forest shadows, and maybe even an awkward wood booger costume that nobody's washed in a while, I personally love seeing that this age-old legend of the man in the woods is getting the respect it deserves. Regardless, if you're camping deep in the forests of Shenandoah, maybe even staying in our next stop, the Corbin cabin, and you hear a soft humming rolling through the trees, maybe, just maybe, you're not alone. Maybe the forest shadows, as they were called, are still out there, watching, guarding, and whispering to one another in a language we might never understand. Or again, maybe that's just Bruce. Either way, I'd zip the tent up tight. In Shenandoah National Park, a place with a lot of history and therefore a lot of hauntings, one trail has earned a particularly haunted reputation: Stony Man Trail. It's not just hikers who say this. Park rangers themselves have reported encounters here that defy explanation. Winding just over a mile from the trailhead at Skyland to one of the most breathtaking summits in the Blue Ridge, the Stony Man Trail appears gentle on the map, but those who walk it often come back with stories that have nothing to do with sweeping views or peaceful strolls in the forest. This may be Shenandoah's most haunted trail, and here are some of the stories most associated with this haunted stroll. The most persistent spirit on the Stony Man Trail is that of a young man, believed to be a hiker who went missing and perished in the area many decades ago. Accounts of him stretch back to the 1980s when a park ranger patrolling the area just after sunset encountered a lone figure, a boy, maybe in his 20s, wearing worn and outdated hiking gear. The ranger, noting the old-style backpack and distressed appearance of the young man, assumed he was lost or injured, but the moment he offered help, the boy vanished into thin air. The exact same description would surface again in the 1990s, this time from a group of hikers. They recalled coming across a similar young man, stressed, barely responsive, and wearing clothes that clearly didn't match the times. He nodded when he was asked if he needed help, but he spoke little to the group of fellow young people. One hiker actually offered him food and water, stepping forward to hand it over, only for the boy to disappear completely right in front of them. So, as I've said, both rangers and visitors alike have reported this same encounter. A 20-something man, disheveled and confused, vanishing just as help is offered to him. Some believe he may have gotten lost in the dense forests decades ago and succumbed to the elements. Others believe his soul is stuck in a loop, forever seeking rescue that will never come. And next, there's the soldier. Several visitors have also seen a man in a tattered Confederate uniform, standing near the summit of Stony Man, staring out over the Shenandoah Valley, as if contemplating something long lost. His clothing is ragged, as if he's endured weeks, if not months, in the wilderness. His posture, always somber, gives the impression of a man grieving or reflecting deeply on a decision. Local historians say it's plausible that Confederate soldiers passed through or even deserted in these mountains during the final period of the Civil War. Desertion, I should note, was a growing issue in the later stages, especially as morale plummeted and the Confederate army crumbled. Some speculate that this ghost might have once worn gray under duress, and perhaps he walked away from his post, vanishing into the ridgelines of Shenandoah. Others, of course, think he might have died in the war itself, either during a hidden skirmish in the region or while fleeing north, and now he lingers on the mountaintop, still looking out for signs of his lost comrades or perhaps even redemption. Even more intriguing, some researchers have captured EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena, near the summit. Brief, whispery sounds, resembling old military commands or mentions of battle plans. Whether residual echoes of the past or the voices of unsettled spirits, they hint at something still unfinished in the soil of Shenandoah. Some theorists even suggest that the Confederate soldier and the lost hiker might be two versions of the same spirit, appearing differently, from different eras, but tied to the same sorrowful fate. And then there's the so-called Weeping Woman. She walks alone along the Stony Man Trail. It's an old-fashioned looking woman, weeping softly as she moves, lost in her grief. Her clothing clearly does not belong to the modern age, and her presence is almost always accompanied by an overwhelming sense of sadness. She doesn't speak, but those who try to offer her help report the same outcome. Again, just like the Boy Scout or whatever, she vanishes without a word. Now, if you buy the local legends, her story is a tragic one. According to them, she hiked this trail with her husband, and they say it was in the early 1900s, but somewhere along the ridge, he fell from a ledge to his death. Though she survived, she was never the same. And now, after death from natural causes later in life, it seems she's still searching for him, walking the trail they once shared, forever seeking a lost love she couldn't save. Again, to be clear, they don't think she died on the mountain, but that her soul returned here after death, drawn by the power of that memory, that moment, and that grief. So, therefore, what makes Stony Man Trail so unnerving isn't the stories, but it's the consistency. The trail isn't long, it's not particularly difficult, yet it continues to generate more ghostly reports than almost any other path in the park. Unlike most urban legends, many of these accounts come from rangers and local researchers, people you'd generally consider reliable who often had no prior knowledge of the stories until they experienced something themselves. And unlike some trails, the mountain itself seems to invite reflection. At the summit, the view opens wide to the valley below, timeless, untouched, and eerily quiet sometimes. It's easy to imagine someone standing here 100 years ago or 160 years ago, looking out and wondering what was going to come next. Some say the spirits on this trail are doing just that, watching, waiting, and remembering the life that they had. So if you're brave enough to visit, the trail begins just across from the Skyland Resort, off Skyline Drive. It's open year-round, and if you go at dusk, when the sun begins to dip behind the ridgeline, you might hear footsteps behind you, still walking the trail they never got off of. The next story, like the Pale Crawler tale, takes place at a shelter, but this one doesn't involve anything that sounds like internet fiction from 2005. This dates back to November 24th of 1989, and while details are a little bit sparse, part of the account comes from a hiker logbook found at an Appalachian Trail shelter. The rest has been passed around online, and interestingly, I heard it myself from a ranger at Shenandoah Visitor Station during a winter drive in 2019, and also these rangers don't really give this stuff out on a whim. I specifically asked, do you have any ghost stories, because I'm weird. So anyways, let's start with those logbooks. These are notebooks kept at AT shelters. They're maintained by local trail clubs usually. Hikers pretty much use these to track their progress. They leave messages, and occasionally they'll record strange or serious events. That last use is where the story begins. See, this happened near the northern end of Shenandoah National Park, and it involved a solo hiker who was braver than most. First off, it was winter. Thanksgiving had just passed the prior day on November 23rd, so the trail was pretty much empty. Also, it was winter, so this man wasn't attempting a full through hike to Mount Katahdin. He was just section hiking through Shenandoah while he had some time off for Thanksgiving. But still, it was risky. Second, he was brave because November 23rd, again the prior day, Thanksgiving, Central and Northern Virginia were hit with 4 to 6 inches of snow, freezing rain, and sleet. Hiking in those conditions was not a small feat. Also again, this was November 23rd of 1989 and November 24th of 1989. After an 8-mile day, this man, our protagonist, reached the Tom Floyd shelter. He dropped his pack, he set up his sleeping bag on the cold wooden floor, and he startled a couple of mice hiding around a trash bag in the corner. He got a fire going, he boiled some water, and he poured it into a pouch of freeze-dried Mountain House mac and cheese. While he waited for it to rehydrate, he flipped through the shelter logbook. He was surprised to see someone had stayed here the night before, though. The first entry, dated 11/23, read something like this. 11/23. Arrived before sunset. Had a baked potato while watching the snowfall. Pretty. Going to try to make it to highway tomorrow to get into Front Royal. That likely meant the hiker planned to exit at Red Mount Road, which intersects the trail just east of Front Royal and north of this shelter. Pretty standard stuff, except for the second entry. This entry was presumably written by that same hiker. It said, 11/24. Woke up to someone calling help, saw footsteps in snow leading away from shelter. None to it, leaving now 5 a.m. Now, that's kind of creepy, and it unsettled our protagonist rightfully. Still, he put the logbook away, he ate his mac and cheese, and he checked if the snow around the shelter had any footprints in it. There were no footprints. Maybe the previous hiker misheard a wild animal, maybe he saw his own tracks going out, and he got confused. Either way, he shook it off. His wife was supposed to pick him up near Red Mount Road the next afternoon, and for now, it was time to sleep. He inflated his sleeping pad, got into his bag on top of the pad, and despite the freezing temperatures, he managed to doze off comfortably, until he heard it. A voice, one quick, simple, but loud, "Help," came from the woods around the shelter. At this, he sat up, he rubbed his eyes, and he instinctively looked towards the spot the hiker had mentioned. And sure enough, there were footprints in front of the shelter. They started just past the lip of the shelter's roof and curved behind it into the thick woods. There were no tracks leading in, just leading out. He called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no answer. He followed the footsteps for a little bit, but when he noticed he was getting deep into the woods, way off trail, he noped out of there. It was around 4:30 a.m. per his watch. He decided he'd had enough sleep and had enough of this. He packed up his sleeping bag, deflated his pad, and got ready to move out. Before leaving, he scribbled his own note in the logbook. 11:25. Saw the footsteps too. F that S. Now, here's where the story gets passed down. According to the ranger I spoke with, the man told the story directly to another older ranger in the summer of 1990 after he came back and actually completed a full through hike. He explained that in 1989 he'd only been section hiking, and this is what happened on that trip. Apparently because of this, there's still a little bit of superstition around the Tom Floyd shelter on snowy nights. Some hikers think there's a spirit out there, maybe a long-gone traveler or an old resident still lingering in the woods. And honestly, considering how many forgotten graves and family cemeteries are hiding in Shenandoah, it's not out of the question. For what it's worth, this story reminds me a whole lot of the Blanket Mountain distress call from our Smoky Mountains episode. That one also came from a ranger, and a hiker too, who swore up and down they heard cries for help in the middle of nowhere. These kinds of stories seem to pop up all over the AT. This is the last one of these in my collection for now though, and the last one I've personally had told to me. I still need to hike the northern parts of the trail though, so I'd bet some money that we'll find something similar in the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine or something. So, what do you think? Have you ever heard a story like this of a hiker, or perhaps something else, calling out in the middle of the night to hikers staying at shelters? Let me know. You know where to find me. Skyland Resort is one of the most haunted places in Shenandoah National Park, and while it comes with a fun haunting, it also has a surprisingly long history. While today, Shenandoah is a bit of a haven for those in the urban areas of Virginia to, quote-unquote, get away from it all, it might surprise you that it's not just the modern hustle and bustle that gave Shenandoah this reputation. See, before Shenandoah National Park was even established, vacationers would come to Shenandoah as a break from the polluted and sometimes crime-ridden city lives they lived, and this lodge, Skyland Resort, was one of the spots they often frequented. In 1854, Samuel and Maria Williams, two folks from Brooklyn, New York, bought 21,371 acres in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. This land changed hands several times, first to a copper company for a speculative $1 million, which was barely paid out, and then partially to the Stony Mining Company, and eventually to the Miners Lode Copper Company led by George H. Pollock and Stephen M. Allen. Copper was indeed found here, but it was never profitably mined, and by 1889, Pollock and Allen were in debt and falling behind on this mortgaged land's payments. Despite this less than favorable circumstance, George H. Pollock's son, George Freeman Pollock, saw a new future for the land, not necessarily in mining, but as a resort. The land would eventually be rebranded, and some lots were sold, and by the early 1890s, things weren't looking good as things collapsed financially again. And in 1896, the property was ordered sold at auction. That being said, George Freeman Pollock, again George H. Pollock's son, with little money but big ambition, convinced the court to let him buy some of the land his father had owned on credit. Over the next decade, he would juggle debt, sell land, and finally pay off the mortgage, though he never fully owned the property. He always had some variety of debt taken out on it. Pollock was no businessman, but he was a master promoter and entertainer. The original resort, then known as Stony Man Camp, not yet Skyland Lodge, consisted of 28 rustic buildings that by today's standards might look more like a scattered campground than a modern lodge. Regardless, it became famous for its charm and spirit. George himself was part of the draw too. George became the camp's unofficial master of ceremonies. He'd blow a bugle each morning to wake up guests, try doing that today and see how many Yelp reviews you get, announce meals like a royal herald, and even put on a whole production just to send out the mail. The camp even had its own newspaper, the Stony Man Camp Bugle Call, which included news, schedules, and presumably polite ghost warnings. Over time, it became the Skyland Lodge, and today it's an attraction of Shenandoah National Park. That being said, of course, this is the Dark Places video for Shenandoah, and given all of this history, it should be no surprise to you that Skyland Lodge is said to be very haunted. Now, the first ghost here is said to be the man who started it all, George Freeman Pollock. George, it's said, is often seen wandering the halls of this main building here, of course sporting period clothing and gazing out of windows. Sometimes they say he even stands in the corners of rooms as if he's trying to spook you. He also doesn't just haunt one spot or one building. He's seen all over the property, and sometimes he apparently knocks before phasing straight through the front door of the smaller buildings that guests are staying in, almost as if he's making sure guests are enjoying their stay. And of course, he knocks like a true ghostly gentleman. And of course, not to be cliche, but then there's the lady in white, because there's always a woman in white. She's a mysterious woman, usually seen in a flowing gown, who glides through the halls of the main building of the lodge, pauses in doorways, and disappears when she's seen. If you feel a sudden chill or a wave of melancholy, that might be her passing by. She's even been spotted inside of guest rooms, staring out windows as if waiting for someone who's never returned, perhaps someone that ghosted her. Okay, sorry, I'll show myself out. Among these guest rooms, too, it's not quite clear why, but room 211 is said to be the most haunted of all of them. And if you stay here, both the lady in white and George are extremely likely to pay you a visit. Perhaps these two had a little bit of a love affair back in the day, but hey, this is just speculation. There's no credence to back it up, and no one really knows who the lady in white was in life, if she even exists in the first place. Beyond this, in both the guest quarters and the main hall, folks that are not these two are said to be frequently seen on the property. Most think these folks that have an odd habit of phasing through walls and not responding to the inquiry of modern-day guests are old guests from long ago, and sometimes they're also the staff of the old Skyland Lodge. These individuals don't really do anything particularly evil. They can just be seen walking, attending to messes, and staring in the distance. And sometimes a couple of them have even been seen laughing together. I actually saw one report online of someone who described this whole seeing the old staff thing as like a party that started in 1903 and never ended, just nobody talks to you. Beyond this, the campus is generally haunted by other less easily attributed ongoings. There are shadowy figures, some think of typical ghosts or just their shadows, seen roaming about. Sometimes empty hallways have clear-sounding footsteps going down them. Some folks hear knocking on their doors only to open them and see nobody here at all. Sometimes furniture even has a knack for scooting around too, often being followed by disembodied voices saying your name or a cold draft hitting you. Outside of the guest quarters, there are also frequent reports of whispering or muttering coming from the nearby woods and feelings of being watched, which is almost certainly just Bigfoot. Pay him no mind. Anyways, that's the haunted Skyland Lodge, another place that's haunted that for some reason people still love to stay in Shenandoah National Park. So this next story takes us back long before this land was known as Shenandoah National Park. I'm talking back in the 1700s and 1800s, when the Blue Ridge Mountains of West Virginia were home to thousands of people. Again, these weren't people passing through or vacationing. They were farmers, blacksmiths, midwives, and moonshiners, families who had actually carved lives into the ridges and hollows of the mountains, in places like Nicholson Hollow, Corbin Hollow, and Weekly Hollow. Often these folks lived here informally. This means they didn't have deeds, they didn't pay rent. They were just people that settled on this land, often practicing subsistence farming. By the mid-1800s, it was actually a relatively populated region, driven by the abundance of land. After the Revolutionary War, land grants here were actually handed out freely to some, and the mountain soil, while rocky and hard, offered a kind of freedom fostered by a lack of desirability not easily found in the valleys below. These settlers weren't wealthy, but they were independent. They grew apples, corn, and tobacco. Some raised pigs, kept bees, or mined for copper. Others survived by trapping, making tools, or herbal medicine. For generations, families like the Nicholsons, Weekleys, and Corbins, of whom the hollows were named after, lived here, but they weren't isolated in the way outsiders like to imagine. Here they built churches, held dances, shared medical care and goods, and maintained trails. There was a community here. By the early 1900s, there were roughly 500 families, about 2,000 people living on what would become the park land. That being said, you've read the title of this section. Trouble was brewing, and the trouble began with an idea that came from far away. Just like that unforeseen buster call on O'Hara, their paradise would soon be tread upon. In the 1920s, the US was riding a wave of conservation enthusiasm, something that, to an extent, I can empathize with. The success of Yellowstone and Yosemite out west inspired a growing movement to preserve wilderness areas for public use. But those parks were far from the East Coast's cities. Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service, wanted to change this, though. By 1925, a commission formed to find a national park site accessible to eastern urbanites, and Virginia's Blue Ridge offered beautiful views, dramatic elevation changes, and, critically, it wasn't already under federal protection. Shenandoah was perfect, except for the people living there. Regardless, in 1926, Congress passed a bill authorizing Shenandoah National Park, on paper. The catch, the federal government wouldn't purchase the land. That responsibility fell to the Commonwealth of Virginia. The state, in turn, would raise money to buy 421,000 acres, mostly from private owners. The target area included homes, farms, and entire mountain communities. This was not a slow, gradual conversation, though. Virginia's leaders, particularly Governor Harry F. Byrd, a political powerhouse from the Shenandoah Valley, were determined to make this park a reality. Byrd, you see, had a vision of modern tourism bringing wealth to the state. His handpicked man to carry this vision out was William Carson, the head of Virginia's Conservation and Development Commission. Carson had no illusions, and he had no plans to carry this out with civility. The mountain families would need to go, and he was ready to make that happen. By 1931, the state began to acquire land. Some owners would sell willingly. Many, some say most, did not though. As I mentioned, many of the mountain people didn't have deeds. They lived on land passed down through generations, often without titles. This meant the state could classify them as squatters, an easy legal pretext for removal. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal brought new energy and funding to the park project. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, moved in to build trails, plant trees, and create infrastructure. But they also had another job, clearing the land. With this, entire communities were surveyed, photographed, and then scheduled for what was essentially demolition. And to justify this forced displacement, officials painted a narrative of the mountain people as backward and poor hillbillies, who were living in filth, ignorance, and were in moral decay. The most famous of these efforts was a 1933 sociological report called Hollow Folk, compiled by the Resettlement Administration and the University of Virginia. It portrayed residents, especially in Corbin Hollow, as illiterate, inbred, and mentally deficient. This wasn't just bias at the time, it was literally a strategy that they concocted this. The reports were used to convince lawmakers and the public that removal was not only necessary but compassionate. And if you can't already tell, these falsehoods created biases that even today many individuals herald as true. Of course, there were some adults in the room. For instance, one of the loudest voices of dissent was Lucy Wortham James, a wealthy philanthropist and conservationist. She had donated land for the park, but also fought to let mountain residents stay in place. A rare but kind noble, more Vivi than St. Charlos, if you catch my drift. She even funded schools and healthcare programs in an effort to help locals adapt, but she was very much outnumbered. Between 1934 and 1937, the government cleared out most of the communities. Evictions were often handled harshly. Families were basically told to pack up and leave, sometimes under a threat of force. Afterwards, homes were burned to prevent reoccupation, and churches, schools, and sometimes even cemeteries were bulldozed. Some residents were resettled in government housing. Others simply disappeared into the valleys. A select few elderly residents were allowed to stay under life tenancy agreements, aka, when you die, we'll take your property. But even those were often violated later. In 1935, President Roosevelt would visit the park under construction and gave a speech lauding it as a triumph of conservation. And 2 years later, in July of 1937, Shenandoah National Park officially opened. Ultimately, the creation of Shenandoah National Park displaced about 465 families, with estimates of 7,000 to 8,000 people being affected when counting seasonal workers, tenants, and descendants. Many of these families never returned. Some descendants still remember their grandparents saying never go back up there because the pain was too raw. That being said, for some, things did improve. In the 1990s and early 2000s, some descendants began organizing homecomings, gatherings inside of the park to honor their roots. Cemeteries within the parks were reclaimed and marked. In 2007, for instance, a permanent exhibit at the Shenandoah National Park Visitor Center was installed to acknowledge the people who had been removed. But even today, this is a story that isn't widely told. Shenandoah is marketed as pristine wilderness, and frankly, it is pristine wilderness. It's a beautiful park, maybe the most well-kept of all of the eastern national parks, but the sacrifices that were made to achieve this are rarely mentioned. Despite this, walk through Shenandoah today, and you'll find ghostly traces of the people who once lived here. Apple trees blooming where homes used to stand, rock walls and cemeteries while climbing through the woods, and foundations hidden beneath leaf litter. You may even walk through places like Corbin Hollow or Nicholson Hollow and not even realize you're pretty much walking through the ruins of communities. People who never actually wanted to leave but were told, in no uncertain terms, that the mountains were no longer theirs. It's easy to forget that America's wild places sometimes came at the cost of its own people. Shenandoah is beautiful, but beneath the trails and overlooks lies a very sad story that I knew I had to tell to conclude this video. It's been nice covering another national park. You know, I could get used to telling these sorts of stories a bit more. Regardless, thank y'all for coming with me today through another one of my favorite places in the USA. Now, if you enjoyed this Dark Places video, be sure to tell me down below, and like the video. It'll keep YouTube happy with me and ensure I keep getting pushed out. Also, if you haven't already subscribed, I'd love to have you along for the ride. Seriously, it's the best way to make sure YouTube shows you my next video when it publishes, if that's something you want. Also, if you feel like donating or joining the channel, I recommend finding my Buy Me a Coffee link. I don't really drink that much coffee, but it will go towards funding my phone service I use to run the live streams and a microphone upgrade in the near future. Also, on the topic of live streams will be uploaded to T-Spot, my other channel. If you want to sub there, I have a few videos planned for that channel too, so check it out. Otherwise, next week we've got Vermont coming up. Now, this may not be the Vermont Weird Folklore video, I'm thinking about doing it in a different order, but I think at the very least, a special on the Bennington Triangle will be coming out, so keep an eye out for that. Okay, otherwise, finally, whether you just heard humming coming from the woods as you were trying to get some shut-eye, or if you were at Dean Cemetery and heard a couple of loud bangs in the woods, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.